Hi, I'm Jenna Laurentowski, and welcome to my podcast. High school was a time that we all remember, whether we tried to block it out or not, but it is a moment in our lives that helped us shape us into the people we are today, both as a person and academically. Luckily, I felt I had a pretty good high school experience, and the teachers I had along the way inspired me to become a teacher myself. And there goes my dreams of ever becoming a millionaire. I told my mom that I wanted to become a teacher, and she scolded me, despite being a teacher herself, and said that teachers are losing pay, and I need a job that will pay better. But the sad reality is she's not wrong. As we all know, COVID has had major effects on almost every aspect of life, and a huge hit in California was the budget cuts towards education, and not only in California, but also across the country. Because of the budget cuts, there was a huge increase in teacher layoffs and a huge decrease in school resources. When I first saw the proposed budget cuts to education, I thought of the teachers that had inspired me to become one myself, and how their jobs are now at risk. And all of us have had at least one teacher who's had a positive influence on our lives. And with these budget cuts, their jobs are at risk as well. COVID, I think for most of us, is the first time we've experienced a pandemic, and it seems like a one-time type of thing. But cuts in education have been a recurring pattern even before COVID. When our economy is faced with hardship, education is the first to face budget cuts. This pattern continues to put teachers and education at risk. It also puts the future generation at risk for being behind in school and not getting the quality education that they deserve. The loss in funds for school will not only affect teachers, but the future education of students and of this country. We and future generations are the future of this country, and quality education is the key to having a country that we want to live in. When COVID hit, one of the first things that surprised me was the proposed budget cut to California schools. EdSource, a website that continuously follows changes in education and has been following budget cuts in California for years, states that with the initial proposal of budget cuts, there could potentially be cuts of $18 billion from education. This would be a 20% decline from the current California budget. Seeing such a huge sum of money taken away from education just in California is very alarming. This would not just be for K through 12 schools, but potentially UC schools in California would feel the effects as well. Schools already lack funding, especially public schools that are K through 12. And although California is losing a lot of money, these budget cuts should be dispersed more evenly, especially when schools are already struggling. This issue would be a lot simpler if this was only happening in California, but it is happening in almost every state in the U.S. This leaves the education system in shambles. There is increased teacher layoffs and a lack of quality in education given to students nationwide. In an article by Christine Bratmucci, a very educated and well-versed woman on struggles within education, she stated that just within the first month of quarantine, school district laid off nearly 1 million workers. A whole million workers within the school district nationwide lost their job earlier this year. The hardest part about this is if these cuts continue, there could potentially lose 300,000 more teachers. That is close to 500,000 more workers within the school system that could potentially lose their jobs. Teachers are one of the biggest resources in giving quality education. With a lack of teachers, the quality of education will go down significantly. One way this could happen is teachers not being able to form connections with students. Being connected in school helps motivate and encourage students. Teachers play a bigger role than just teaching, but in also motivating and encouraging students to do their best and be their best. With less teachers, this motivation could be challenged. Sadly, a lack of funding or budget cuts to education is a recurring pattern. Education always is one of the first things to lose funding when an economic downturn hits. It made one question, why is the education system not protected against these huge cuts? Lenny Mendoza was the chief economic and business advisor to Gavin Newsom. He did a podcast in a series called Adventures in Ed Funding that dig into educational funding. Lenny Mendoza specifically talks about California's situation. Mendoza brought up interesting points about how education can help society from many aspects and not just educational. Mendoza says that investing in education can not only help the quality of education, but other things like equity, because people will be educated. Education can provide people with a better quality of life, and being educated, one can have a better job and be on an equal playing field with everyone else who has a degree. Mendoza really emphasizes how important it is to be educated and having funding in education, but he also talks about the reality that education faces. It is not a priority, and it is not very protected from facing these budget cuts. Just within California, there are many things that need funding, and it is hard to decide where these cuts should come from. But what I think it is important to focus on, relating back to what Mendoza said, education helps create equity for people. It helps provide better quality of life. Education should not be one of the first things to face budget cuts, because in the end, you could potentially be putting people at a disadvantage. The quality of education overall is going to be the thing most affected by these cuts. Nothing positive comes from taking money out of schools. We know that a lot of public schools already do not have proper funding. This can even correlate over to colleges offered in certain states. Certain important resources may not be offered anymore to students. An example we have even seen at Boise State is certain sports having to be cut due to a lack of money. Now, my mom is a middle school English teacher. Something that has always surprised me and kind of bothered me was my mom having to buy supplies for her own class with her own money. My mom repeatedly has to buy basic essentials. This is a prime example of a lack of funding in schools already. Out of the article EdSource that has been following this issue on educational budget cuts, it is stated that the schooling system has fought to get more funding for years, and that is all lost with just in these few months. These cuts would undo the last 6 years of progress that have been made on school funding. It seems crazy to me that there has been such a push for funding and that all of that is just pulled away. Students and teachers should be and are alarmed of this drastic cut in school budgeting. For teachers, this affects their job. Teachers are not sure if they will have jobs in the future, or are worried about being paid enough, or being overworked and having bigger class sizes. Students worry if they're going to receive the proper education to be successful in their future educational career. As college students, knowing that we are getting a good education to help us succeed in our future is a big deal, and sadly, budget cuts threatens this. James Herrick tells us about how rhetoric builds communities, and there's a big community surrounding the educational system. Millions of people are affected by these nationwide budget cuts. Okay, after all that information, I think we need a little music break. Cue the music. 3, 2, 1. Coming back. So what? Why does this matter? Ultimately, any further budget cuts are going to continue to hurt the school system and affect our future and possibly future generations. Kids need proper education in order to grow into well-rounded people in their future and to ultimately have a stable life. And a common phrase is, children are the future of the world, which, though very cliche, is also true. If kids are not getting quality education, what will our world look like when we are older? Beyond the students, there are also teachers. Teachers now have added stress about the stability of their jobs on top of trying to provide quality education for students. There are also schools already in poverty-ridden areas that are going to continue to decline. There are many schools in California that are in low-income areas, and these schools will only increase in violence and decrease in quality of education. This issue of budget cuts has a domino effect. One thing affects the other. It is a big issue with a lot of different aspects that affect a lot of different people. Education has always faced a lack of resources and a lack of funding, but the ones it is facing because of COVID will impact education more than we've ever seen before. Money will be taken away from schools when schools need it the most. Students, teachers, and families will be affected by these budget cuts. Overall, a vast majority of people in this country will be affected in one way or another. Students will lack the quality of education they deserve. Teachers could potentially lose their jobs and fear the stability in their jobs, and families can become frustrated at the school system with the lack of resources. But there is hope. There are people within the school systems fighting against these budget cuts, and even within the government themselves. There is still hope when it comes to the education system. As students who not only care about our own future, but the future of our country as a whole, we should be willing to join this fight against budget cuts. A way to help is to get in contact with your local government, whether that be an email, a letter, or even meeting with them, and telling them the effects these will have. Let your local governments know that these budget cuts of this magnitude are just not acceptable, and fight for your own education.